Now then, we face a world in disarray. And at this point in the coronavirus pandemic, even the most deluded leaders would struggle to deny that our social, economic and political systems are broken. Those are the words of the Secretary-General of Amnesty International, Agnès Callamard, as she has launched the human rights organisation's annual report. Agnès Callamard, she's French, just over a week ago, took up her new job at Amnesty. She joins us now on the programme. Thanks very much for joining us today. A world in disarray, you say. I mean, isn't it that a little bit pessimistic? I mean, some might say that actually the world has so far in many, many countries held together pretty well. Governments able, with difficulty, let's be honest, to make decisions and support their people in their hour of need.
Look, you should say that to the families of the 3 million dead and rising around the world. So no, I think 2020 is a demonstration that our global system of governance has failed, and that in the vast majority of countries around the world, the national governance system has failed. And it has failed the most vulnerable, it has failed the one that were the poorest, it has failed the women. There is absolutely no sign of victory for 2020 when it comes to formal governance system. There is much that can be said about the people themselves. There is much that can be said about the medical workers, about the sanitation workers, about the people in the shop that fed us, about the people in the platform, technology platform that allowed us to get the package we needed. That we can celebrate their forms of governance and solidarity. We can celebrate the solidarity and governance of those that raise against repression, against systemic racism, whether it's in the United States, Black Lives Matter, in Belarus, in Hong Kong, in Iraq. But about our government, I'm sorry. Overall, failure. Zero.
You mentioned several countries that you're particularly critical of. Picking out a couple of them, the Philippines, Brazil.
Yes, absolutely. Look, many governments around the world have either implemented measures to respond to COVID that were disproportionate, that did not take into account the particular vulnerability of groups. I have here in mind homeless, the extreme poor, people in the informal sectors, all of whom cannot survive behind lockdown. They starve. So none of those measures were taken with those groups in mind. So that's the first problem. The second is that in many countries around the world, police were given additional power to implement those measures, which meant that in addition to being victimized by the first measures, those groups were victimized by police violence, which were in the increase. In the Philippines, President Duterte even allowed the police to shoot at those that were breaking the lockdown. Who are those people? They were those who could not stay behind lockdown. They did not have a home to stay in. They lived in slums, and they needed to look for food. In Brazil, the vast majority of victims were Afro-Brazilians. They were the poorest of the Brazilian population. They were also those that died because of COVID, because of crumbling health system and discrimination in terms of access to health. So that is two examples, but I have to say those two examples, you find them with more or less strength everywhere in the world.
And police brutality is something that comes up in other countries. It even comes up in France, doesn't it? You're concerned about police brutality here, and also new laws being brought in France after the murder of Samuel Paty.
Absolutely. So France is one example of a government that has adopted laws behind COVID or in the name of COVID that were disproportionate in terms of their impact. Laws that curtail freedom of association, laws and measures, they were not necessarily laws, that attributed exceptional powers to the police.
But they're designed to protect people, aren't they?
Exceptional powers. They can only protect people if they are proportionate and necessary. Courts in France have said many of those measures are actually neither proportionate nor necessary. It's not just Amnesty's findings, it's French court findings. And let me add that the continuing use by the police in France of a non-lethal weapon of the kind that we have seen, of the kind that wound terribly, that disable people, that continuing use is in fact in violation of international law. It has been denounced by the UN, and we must do everything we can to call on the French government to prevent the use of those non-lethal weapons.
You praise the efforts of ordinary people. You mentioned this earlier on. You single out Black Lives Matter protesters in countries like Poland and Hong Kong too.
Yes, absolutely. Throughout 2020, there was leadership. That came from the little people. It came from the workers I've already mentioned, many of whom are actually of migrant origin in many countries around the world, or of the informal sector, or of the Dalit in India. And leadership came from people who stood up, who raised against systemic racism, against repression. Black Lives Matter is one example that became a global movement, and we need to celebrate and do everything we can to support the search against systemic racism. It came from the Belarus, for the women in Belarus. So there were many examples of incredible force, incredible courage, and incredible leadership. It did not come from governments. And if I may, in 2020, we are starting 2020, and we are seeing government continuing the policies that brought us to our knees in 2020.
And just briefly, I just want to ask you, sorry to interrupt, running out of time, I just want to ask you briefly, you mentioned incredible leadership. You're taking over Amnesty yourself, of course. What do you think and hope you'll be able to bring to the role and to Amnesty as an organisation?
Look, I'm bringing my experience. I'm working with great honor for this organization. It has a fantastic history. My first step is one of feeling humbled by it. I want to listen. I want to learn. I want us, so as an organization, to be bold and to be courageous. The context we are confronting is extremely complex and difficult. We have many human rights fronts. The first front I want us to get involved in is to ensure that there is vaccinations for everyone around the world. I want to take this opportunity to call on people, on your audience, to say that the patent that is being prevented from being globalized, the vaccination patent, that is a human rights violation. Governments, the richest governments, failing to feel responsible for the rest of the world. We need the first step that we are doing as in 2020 must be to ensure that everyone around the world can have access to this vaccine. This can only happen if production of vaccine is multiplied. That can only happen if the patent, if the trademark for the vaccine is opened to the rest of the world. Knowledge is shared, training is given, so that we can all have access to that vaccine. This is the first step we must take as an international community.
Sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, but great to talk to you today. Good luck in the job as well. Secretary General of Amnesty International. Thanks.